Welcome all. So glad that you are joining us tonight at BJ for a program about the land. I'm Rabbi Shuli Passo. I am the Director of Community Engagement at BJ and really pleased to welcome all of you and all of our illustrious speakers tonight for a really important conversation that is part of our Shemitah programming, our programming this year, focusing on the sabbatical year, the seventh year of rest that the Torah mandates us to observe. And though that's not directly relevant to most of us who are not farmers in the land of Israel, there is much to learn from how the Torah instructs us to observe this seventh year of rest, particularly as we consider the environmental and climate crises that we are deeply mired in. And I chose that song as a little welcome in music because it's a great song and it's nice to have some music playing when people are coming into the Zoom. But I love it, and I think many of us love it and love the sentiment that the land belongs to all of us. But the truth is that the Torah sees things a little bit differently, and both in the context of writing about the Shemitah year, and also a couple of weeks ago in the context of the preparation for the revelation at Sinai, God says, Ki li haaretz, for the land is mine. The land is actually not yours, it's mine. It's of divine provenance and divine ownership, may not quite be the right word, but it's a reminder that our presence here on this earth is a gift, and we are meant to be here as stewards of the planet and not to treat it as something that is ours, that we can use as we wish, that we can throw away as we wish. And unfortunately, we haven't risen as the human race to that vision yet, but perhaps we might, and perhaps where we are right now, unfortunately, in this period of crisis may spur us to take a closer look and take to heart the words of the Torah and the understanding that our tradition brings to our relationship, to human relationship with the planet, that it's really not ours. We're here to live here, to benefit from it, but also to protect it and guard it and ensure that it continues on. So we are really very grateful and fortunate to have with us this evening a number of leading thinkers and doers and activists who are trying to make that a reality, both in the Jewish world and in New York and in this country writ large. I am not going to read everyone's full biographies. They are long and impressive and absolutely marvelous. And if I did that, that would be the whole program. So I will invite you to read them in full on the BJ website, on the link where you, on the page where you signed up for tonight's event. And I will just say very briefly that we are very fortunate to welcome Stephan Edel, who is the coalition coordinator of New York Renews and has decades of experience working on environmental justice and labor issues in New York City and in New York State. He's joined by Christina Herman, the program director for climate change and environmental justice at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. So we'll be learning about ICCR's approach to addressing climate change and sustainability through investing. And Anthony Rogers-Wright, who is the Director of Environmental Justice at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, guiding and coordinating the organization's environmental justice strategy, litigation, organizing, and advocacy initiatives. And our moderator for the evening, we're so pleased, Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, founder and CEO of Dayenu, a new organization that is mobilizing the American Jewish community to confront the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. So welcome, everyone. I want to also just note that the primary organizer of tonight's event is Kiana Davis, who's our manager of social action and social justice initiatives at BJ, and she is attending her first night of the semester in her graduate program. So that is why she's not here, but I want to say a big thank you to Kiana for all of her work in making this program possible, and we hope that she'll be able to join us at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennie. I'm going to invite you to at any point put questions in the chat. If you direct them to Jennie in the chat, she will incorporate them, bring them into the conversation toward the end, and stay tuned for some other information coming in the chat later in the evening. And right now, it's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Jennie Rosenn.
Thanks, Julie. Really wonderful to be here tonight with the BJ community. I will just share personally that in addition to being one of my favorite shuls to be in, it's actually where I said Kaddish for my father in your morning minyan a few years ago. And since then has been an even more precious community to me. So really honored to be here tonight to moderate a panel on climate crisis. I'll also say that usually I'm a speaker, I'm not the moderator, so it feels very luxurious tonight to be the one asking the questions rather than responding to them. So, and with friends and colleagues, I couldn't be more delighted. So before we jump in, the climate crisis is not an easy topic. And I think that it's natural for it to raise a lot of feelings. And so I just want to invite everyone to take a moment, maybe even if you're comfortable, take a deep breath and just check in with yourself, knowing that we are about to spend the next hour and 15 minutes talking about climate change, talking about climate action, talking about climate devastation. What are you feeling right now? And I want to invite you, if you're comfortable, to share in the chat what's coming up for you. Just a word, a phrase, as you anticipate this evening. Fear and faith, hope, scared, anger, tragedy, open, worried, excited, stop methane leaks, solidarity, overwhelmed by the breadth of crisis. Thank you. We each have our own journeys, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, for some of us activist, when it comes to awakening and engaging with the climate crisis. And I imagine that some of you have been on this journey for a long time, grappling with this. And for others, this marks a newer conversation. I'm wondering how many of you, just by a show of hands, are more concerned about the climate crisis now than you were, say, 5 years ago? Yeah. This isn't surprising, right? We know the science. We read the staggering predictions of sea level rise. We feel the heat. We witness the floods and the hurricanes that are wreaking havoc across our nation, across the globe. And we know that without very significant changes, we are hurtling towards an unlivable and unsustainable future. As Jews, we have faced existential crises, disruption, destruction, the threat of annihilation many times throughout history. And each time we've not only survived, but we've envisioned and rebuilt a different future. And we are in such a moment right now. And as you might imagine, there are so many values that call us in this moment, right? They're the classic ones that we hear all the time, right? Shomrei Adama, protecting the earth, Bal Tashchit, the prohibition to waste. But there are many other values that call us to climate action right now. B'charta b'chaim, choose life. Shomer ger yatom v'almana, protecting the most vulnerable. Tirdof Tzedek, pursuing justice. Because we know that the impacts of the climate crisis rest disproportionately on those who've been historically marginalized. People living in the global south, in poverty, particularly vulnerable areas, and people who've experienced racism and other kinds of bigotry. I think of the climate crisis as like a force multiplier. It exacerbates historical inequities, even as it impacts everyone. It's kind of like coronavirus in that sense. None of us, regardless of wealth or skin color, is safe from the impacts, but it doesn't affect us all equally. Justice, tzedek, is central to this work and to this crisis. And at its most basic, addressing the climate crisis is about the very concept of living l'dor v'dor, generation to generation. Will the generations continue? And what kind of lives will our children and grandchildren have? I saw someone put in the chat, what about my grandchildren? Research shows that actually more than 80% of American Jews are concerned about the climate crisis, and most are not taking action. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, which we can discuss later tonight or at another time. But Dayenu, the organization that I founded and lead, was launched 20 months ago to give American Jews pathways to take the kind of meaningful strategic action at the scale that science and justice demand. And also to support Jews and Jewish communities to face and move through the anxiety and the angst and the grief that the climate crisis raises. So rooted in Jewish values, Jewish experience and spirit, we're working to ensure a livable and sustainable world for all people by building a multi-generational Jewish movement that, as Shuli said, is confronting the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. So we're mobilizing Jewish support for climate solutions. We're building our collective power with national and global movements, and we're raising up a spiritual, religious, and moral voice. So I was asked to give this brief context for Dayenu's work. We'll share a little bit more at the end of the program. But tonight, I have the great pleasure of moderating a panel of leaders from 3 other organizations, partner organizations, that are working to address climate change on a systemic level. 2 of them right here in New York City, New York State, and 1 nationally. So one more word before we dive in. I want to say something about how we tackle the climate crisis, because there are so many levers for change, and you're going to hear tonight about a few of them. But one thing is very clear. If we're going to mitigate the most devastating impacts of climate change, right? If we're going to avert total climate collapse, we need to make sure that the levers we're pulling are making change on a systemic level. Because while personal practices are very important for our own integrity, for our own spiritual practice, for our own communal practice, personal practices like reducing meat consumption and communal practices like greening our institutions, these are important. But if every single person and institution significantly lowered their carbon footprint, we would not avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. It's simply too late for that. And I think the statistic that most illustrates this is in 2020, when the world was homebound because of the coronavirus. We all talked about the birds, the air. In reality, daily carbon dioxide emissions fell just 7%. The other 93% of emissions are embedded into the infrastructure and economy of our nation. And to address that, we need to make change on a systemic level. Some of you know Bill McKibben, the climate journalist and activist, one of the most brilliant communicators I have the pleasure of knowing. And he says, one of my favorite things, he says, the climate crisis no longer yields to individual actions. There is no way to make the math work 1 Tesla or 1 vegan dinner at a time at this point. The most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join movements that are sharp enough to make change. So there are a lot of ways that action can look. Dayenu had a big mobilization during Elul and the high holidays. Anthony, you were there with us in Brooklyn. We had 16 communities across the nation of Dayenu activists organizing public actions, bringing 1,000 Jews and partners to their senators' doorsteps, calling them with the blast of the shofar, calling our elected officials to have the courage and moral clarity to pass a just green recovery. But there are a lot of ways that action can look, and we're going to hear about a few of those tonight. We know that to reach net zero emissions well before 2050 is going to take some serious heavy lifting. And this is what we're going to need to do if we're going to avert the most catastrophic impacts. And what happens or doesn't happen in the next 10 years will define our future. This is the decade for action. So I am delighted to be here to explore some of those levers for change with three very thoughtful climate leaders. I want to invite, as I'm posing questions to our speakers and they're responding, as you have questions that come in, please put them in the chat. And we will be spending a good 15 minutes or so at the end in conversation and responding to your questions. So if I don't raise them right away, don't despair. We will come to them. So Anthony, I'd like to kick this off with you. You've done climate justice work in several different contexts. I'm curious how, where you are now, New York Lawyers for Public Interest, what does that approach to the climate crisis look like? And are there other approaches that you've led at other organizations that are similar, different? Share with us some of your work.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, and it's so great to be here. And I've gotten to witness your own spiritual audacity at said event with our majority leader, Chuck Schumer. You're amazing, and you're such a shiro. I want to say hello to the BJ community who has such major vicarious significance for me. Rabbi Sharon Brous, who of course is the rabbi who really exploited my spirituality and brought it out of me, who I spent many years with Eddie Carr, of course, got her roots at BJ. And so it's great to be with you tonight. Well, wow. It's really interesting because I left the Climate Justice Alliance to join New York Lawyers for Public Interest, and Climate Justice Alliance is so grassroots and really built in local and translocal movements and building that and scaling it up and scaling it out. And so when I got the opportunity to come to New York Lawyers for Public Interest, it was a bit of a struggle for me, because I mean, the great part is I do get to work more closely with my brother Stephan, who will speak more in a moment with New York Renews. But it was a real massive shift to, okay, we're going to approach this really from policy and accountability. In environmental justice, which I'm the director of, right, as we learned with the lynchings of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, that wasn't justice, that was accountability, right? Like justice would have been that they wouldn't have been lynched in the first place. And so I had to really understand what that meant for me, of like, I'm working with lawyers now. I'm not a lawyer. I dropped out of law school, as a matter of fact. I like to say that my Judaism includes me dropping out of law school, because I think that in itself could be a mitzvot, but that's here nor there. We can talk about that another time. But we're dealing at it from the standpoint of we're going to confront bad policy and try to reshape it. And we're also going to hold governments accountable when they are not serving the people. And that's ultimately, I said, we need to do that. We absolutely need to do that. And that's also rooted in my Judaism, Rabbi. I mean, I think that throughout the history of our people, it's always been about like holding governments accountable, even the government of Eretz Israel. When Eretz Israel, we don't believe is acting in a way that is righteous, with there's so many conflicts that surround Eretz Israel. It's incumbent upon us through mitzvot to raise accountability, and I think that tzedakah, even though it's rooted in justice, it also means like holding accountable. So that's the work that I do now. It's really, how do we write policy? How do we implement policy in a way, as you said earlier, that really centers the people who are disproportionately impacted? Because that's got to be the baseline. If the baseline is only affluent people, as you were saying, with individual choices, right? I remember living in California and speaking with Rabbi Brous and saying, who cares if the only people driving Priuses are in Marin County and Beverly Hills? That's not going to do anything for air quality. And I really think that that's what shaped my idea of writing policy that starts with the baseline of the most oppressed. And if we build that up and if we save them, then axiomatically the rest of us will also be saved.
Thanks, Anthony. Christina, you lead environmental and climate justice at the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, ICCR, and divestment and investment, core strategies for addressing climate, and core strategies in your work. Why is that an important strategy?
Well, let me just say a little bit about ICCR so people know who we are. So ICCR is a 50-year-old coalition of institutional investors, faith-based and socially responsible institutional investors. So we're, interfaith. About half of our membership is religious pension funds of one sort or another. The other half are values-based institutional investors, sort of socially responsible investors. We have a mix of labor union pension funds, foundations, NGOs that work closely with us on our campaigns. We work across a variety of areas, but climate change, the climate crisis is the most important issue. And the question of divestment versus, investment and engagement, different members have different strategies, but we primarily work in engaging companies. So our members use negative and positive screens on their portfolios. You can screen out tobacco, fossil fuels, guns, or you can invest in those companies to engage them. And so, so that's engagement is I think our major tactic and our major strategy. But proxy voting, if you own a company directly, you'll get the proxy in either, through an email or in the mail. And it's really important to vote your proxies and vote for the resolutions that we're all filing. And I'll go into that in a little bit. Impact investing is another really important strategy. So there are a lot of different ways that investors can weigh in on the climate crisis and try to affect, the companies we're engaging. On the engagement front, we engage companies directly in dialogue. We have multi-stakeholder roundtables and we file a lot of resolutions. And those are the things that get voted on at the annual general meetings. We've been asking companies to change policies and change their operations since the first resolutions were filed against companies over apartheid in South Africa. To try to get them to change how they were operating in that country at the request of the South African churches. We work collectively and collaboratively. So, and when we talk to companies, as we're engaging them on climate related issues, we make the moral as well as the business case. So, a human rights lens is the basis for all of our work. I'd say the lens, we talk about the lens through which we do our climate work being just transition. So I know we're going to could talk about that in a bit later, but I think, divestment is an important signal in the economy. And it's very meaningful, or can be, as a way to shift the market. It's also true that we're in the middle of a transition, and we need companies to change. And how do they change? Well, they change in part through pressure, well, largely through pressure. They'll change in relation to market signals, but they can also change through direct engagement. And so what we have done, and what this ecosystem of investors of which we're a part, is we're organized and we're working collectively, collaboratively in engagements with key oil and gas companies. In some cases, we're engaging a lot of energy utilities because they're consumers of energy. They produce energy and we need them to be producing clean energy. And so that our just transition work really is focused on the energy utility sector. We're also very concerned about natural gas and how long of a bridge that's going to be. And so we're talking with gas utilities about transitioning. It's a little bit of an easier conversation to talk with a utility that is producing electricity and may have a gas arm, because they can move those gas customers to electric and not lose customers. But, there's some utilities out there, gas utilities, that are just standalone. So it's not an easy conversation to have with these companies, but there are a lot of arguments for it. We cannot use fossil fuels. We cannot continue to use them. We can't continue to have our banks finance fossil fuel activity and infrastructure. We filed a whole host of resolutions this year with banks and insurance companies, both in the US and in Canada, asking them to align with the report of the IEA, the International Energy Agency, that says if we're going to stay under 1.5, we can't have any new fossil fuel development. It's like no new fields. And so we asked the banks to adopt a position that they will not finance new fossil fuel activity. They probably will not do that, but at least, we've started the conversation, and we're putting that in front of other investors. So maybe I'll stop there, but.
Thanks, Christina. So I want to bring us from the national to the local. Stephan, you work with New York Renews, an incredible, I think of it as like, sometimes rabbis think about like wrangling all of the different interests in a community. You wrangle a lot of interests across our community. How would you describe the approach of New York Renews to addressing climate? And how do you think about the lever that New York Renews is pulling?
Great, thank you. And very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today and join you all. So let me start with just who we are in a way. New York Renews is a coalition. We're not an individual organization. We're 300 plus now organizations around New York State. It really grew out of the organizing around the People's Climate March in 2014, and people asking, how do we win together, right? To go back to what you said, we no longer, even then, could win and change the world in the way it needed to be changed to survive, for our communities to survive as the threat of climate change was worsening, and we were realizing that with the status quo. And so how do we bring people together who are very different, often have very different interests, and in many cases are not traditionally focused on climate change or traditional environmental issues, together to work together and accomplish this incredibly monumental task, to push back on the fossil fuel interests, to push back on not just political roadblocks, but the broad cultural shift that's going to have to happen in order for this to be successful. And together we're working to build a world where climate justice is centered, where nobody is left behind. So New York Renews really developed out of grassroots leadership saying we have to be front and center, that we have to listen, as Anthony said, to those who are most impacted, right? A clean energy economy that is built along the same lines as the prior economy is not going to serve our communities. And, it's not going to be successful, right? We cannot win this fight by alienating the people we need to fight alongside us and treating them poorly because they haven't traditionally been on our side, or we haven't recognized the ways in which they have. A clean energy economy has to be built to include Black and brown communities, low-income communities, those who have been traditionally treated as sacrifice zones, frontline communities that are doing environmental justice work and have sort of been marginalized by the environmental movement because they're worried about whether their kids get asthma, not whether we hit 1.5 degrees. BIPOC communities all over the state and working class communities are fighting against infrastructure, and it's the same fight. And at the same time, the workers in those communities, the labor unions, the businesses, don't want to see the world continue to burn, and they want to see progress made, but without sort of a structure that brings folks together and recognizes our differences, because we can't simply plow ahead saying, okay, we all agree on climate change, now let's ignore that difference. That we can in fact make tremendous progress. That's why we bring together members from all of these different sections of the community, all these different factions, from Buffalo to Long Island, from business to anti-capitalists, all across the state, to try and figure out how do we make that path forward. And we've grown as a coalition and as a collaborative from about 40 organizations in 2015 to now over 300. The urgency to address these issues, whether it's climate change or the jobs crisis or the COVID crisis or the economic crisis that for many communities never went away before it was reinvigorated by the pandemic, they're all connected, and the solutions have to be connected as well. So despite these huge challenges and the entrenched interests, we've actually made a lot of progress. And we're not there yet. We're not winning, probably is safe to say, but we continue to hack away little bits of the beast and make progress. So I'll pause for a second and just ask if folks here are aware that in 2019, and actually probably talk later on about the city as well, in 2019, New York State passed a landmark climate bill, climate justice bill, no less, that was really radically transformative and changes the way, if we make them implement it correctly, the entire state operates. From the dog catcher to the state budget, it is now the law of the land in New York that we have to meet climate goals, and that we can, or folks like Anthony's colleagues can sue you, can try and sue you and hold you accountable for it. And equity goals, right? To say that it is also not just a question of reducing our overall carbon emissions, but that we have to do it in ways that do not increase the burden and the harms for communities that have been treated so poorly. So that bill was the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, passed in 2019. And we're right now in a really critical moment as the state continues to work on what that's going to look like. What does it mean, and how are we going to implement it? We're also, in addition to working with stakeholders all across the state to work on that, trying to work on getting the state to fund it, right? We essentially asked state workers and communities to do a lot more, even as last year we had an austerity budget and had money off the table and folks were dealing with the pandemic and all of these other crises. This year we have a huge budget surplus. We have federal funding. We have a whole bunch of tools at our disposal as a state. And the state event essentially said, that's great. We're going to put money into the reserve. We're going to put $1 billion into potholes. We're going to do a whole bunch of other things, some of which are really good. But you know what we're not going to do is actually fund the law, because we don't have to, right? It'll get sorted out. The technologists and the businesses and prayer, I guess, all of these things will add up to changing and addressing climate change. But the state isn't going to hire people to do it. So that's our big demand at the moment. And then we have a plan we've worked out with community groups and community members all across the state for how to continue that momentum and funding, how to build the power of the movement. And we're continuing to work with allies all across the state to try and make that a reality. So love to talk more in discussion, but I'll maybe leave it there.
Stephan, just a follow-up question, because you started to talk about what's going on right now for New York City. How does what happens in New York actually have national impact? I know one of the things that people often say to us at Dayenu is, you know, you have so many Jews in places like New York and California and not in places like West Virginia, where we really need to be, you know, putting influence. And yet we know that what happens in New York and California has tremendous national impact. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give two examples, but I'm sure others on the panel can talk more when we get into discussion. I mean, very concretely, you know, we saw, you know, there was a race between states, right? States that want to do better and are learning from each other. And so California was making progress, and New York looked at it and said, we can learn from that. And we passed a law that was even better. And what we've seen really fast from there is that states from Illinois, right, not just California and the big coastal states, but Illinois, Michigan, a whole bunch of states have actually really aggressively moved their climate goals and policy forward. And at the federal level, when the Biden administration came in, they were looking around and said, how do we do this? What are we doing right? There's a lot of critiques. Anthony can talk even more than I can about what the federal government is doing wrong about that. But the Biden administration issued an executive order in the first few weeks that said, look at what New York is doing. There's things here that we are going to take word for word and say the federal government has to do that. And that kind of shift we do see really dramatically when we have these policy wins at the state level. And it reverberates down as well, right? As the state puts money and focus and a change in framework forward, New York City is rethinking how it does things, counties and cities all over the state are. And New York is, for lots of reasons, a huge benchmark, right? We're one of the largest economies in the world, right? We'd be the 11th largest country's economy in the world, not something to sneer at. And we're also a cultural figure that is important, right? As much as some folks denigrate New York and want to sort of say really veiled anti-Semitic things about it, like everybody in the world notices when we do something here in New York.
Thanks, Stephan. Christina, you mentioned just transition, which is something that gets thrown around a lot. And I know this is something central to your work. Can you start by just defining what's meant by just transition and why is this so important? And I'm also going to actually give you a second definitional question. It came in over the transom while you've been speaking. What is this 1.5 that everyone is referring to?
Well, why don't I start with that? Because that's really fundamental. So in the Paris Agreement, so we've been throwing fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels puts carbon dioxide in the air. Fracking for oil and fracking for gas emits methane. Methane is what they call a short-term climate forcer. All of these greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere where they prevent sunlight from escaping back into the solar, or into space, and they warm the earth. So we're warming at an unsustainable rate, and scientists have gauged that we're not going to be able to avoid warming up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The hope is that we don't go above that. It's going to be extremely difficult to stop warming at that point. But that's the goal of the Paris Agreement at this point, because the goal was like this arbitrary, sort of 2.2 degrees centigrade warming. And then when they did studies, they realized we would have horrific storms. There would be droughts, flooding, fires. All the things we're seeing now would be escalated much more intense at 2 degree warming. So that's why the 1.5 is so important. It's really an effort to keep from having, these really devastating climate impacts. Everybody thought 2 degrees was going to be okay. It's not. So on just transition, I was really happy to hear what Stephan was saying. I mean, I wasn't at all surprised, but I completely agree. So just transition is, it's a transition. We're going through a massive transition of the economy now, the energy economy, because we have to move off fossil fuels and we have to move to, some kind of energy production that's going to heat and cool our buildings, that's going to power our transportation, that, is basically going to power our economy. And we have to do that in a way that is not going to put these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That is a huge change because a big chunk of the economy is tied to fossil fuels. And it's not that there are so many workers involved. It's a very powerful sector politically and economically. And so they have been trying to prevent change for a very long time. Anyway, so we're all working. This is what we're doing. We're working for this transition, to transition away from fossil fuels to something that's more sustainable and that will enable all of life to continue on the planet. I mean, it's as existential as that. In that transition will have great impacts on communities and on workers. And I'll give you an example, because in the energy utility sector, which is about a third of emissions in the United States, maybe a little bit less now, about 25%. As companies move off of coal, and eventually they'll have to move off gas, they shut coal plants. Sometimes they can repurpose them, but typically not. So those workers need to do something else. They either retire early, which is what's happened in a lot of cases, or they get moved to another part of, they can take a job elsewhere in the company. But, you know, it's important that they not just be left without a job. What is happening with the new energy economy, if you're building out solar and wind, what do those jobs look like? This is a heavily unionized sector. They're good union jobs in utility companies. The line workers, you know, so the electrical unions, the workers in the plants, they're unionized, they're good middle-class jobs. The new jobs coming online with wind and solar are not. They're coming, you know, it's like $15, maybe $18 an hour, no benefits, and they're not, they're just not the same kind of jobs. So one of the things we're talking to companies about is what is happening to your workers in the transition. Are you, you know, and sometimes they're, you know, usually they're covered by some sort of union contract. So the existing workers don't have to worry so much, but still they're living with a lot of uncertainty. They really don't know when their jobs are going to disappear, because sometimes the companies don't tell them, they don't give them a heads up. So what happens to workers? What happens to communities? Who bears the burden of the cost shift? So they close a coal plant. That coal plant may have been paying taxes. So supporting, you know, the rate base, or supporting the tax base in that community. This happened in Tonawanda, New York. The community realized this plant owned by NRG, big utility company, is going to close, and we're going to lose a huge chunk, maybe half the tax base. And what's going to happen to teachers? You know, how are we going to pay for teachers' salaries, firefighters, policemen, you know, all of the services that had been carried by that. So that's another big issue. So it's both the plant closure and what happens to people in that, and the build out, what's happening, what is life going to be like for the workers in that new economy.
Thanks, Christina. Shuli opened. I want to sort of take us out of the particulars and up a level. Shuli opened talking about Shemitah, and this being a Shemitah year. And this being a central piece of how BJ is engaging in this work and other work. And I know this is something, Anthony, that you've spoken about before. As a Jew, as a climate justice activist, why is Shemitah important? And how does it relate for you personally to your work?
Yes, thanks so much for that question. I think it's really interesting because many of the mitzvot that were enjoined upon us as Jewish people had to do with what Hashem commanded, but really rooted in common sense, right? In a common, natural common sense of, hey, you're wandering the desert. You probably shouldn't eat food that you can't preserve. That makes a lot of sense. You know, eating bad shellfish is not a good idea, nor is eating pork that you can't preserve. And then there's this idea also of, look, I mean, so many times, you know, we hear in Bereshit, Genesis, all through Leviticus, Numbers, of this idea of Hashem saying, I gave you this land, and damn it, you're going to respect it or you're going to piss me off. You know, and I think that also makes a lot of sense. So this idea that you know, I've commanded that you, because even I, Hashem, the Almighty Hashem, had to take a day of rest after creating this planet for you, which is everything that you need, you know, so you probably shouldn't destroy it, right? And it's interesting because right in the beginning of the Torah, we Israel, of course, means struggle. Judaism is all about navigating contradictions for me. And right in Bereshit, it's like we have two mitzvot that are conflicting with each other. You are stewards of the land, dominion over the land. And what does that actually mean? I think it means that I think Shemitah is kind of like what helps us navigate it, of just like being, if you want to dominate the land or have dominions over the land, you have to take care of it. And the dominion is a dominion of justice, right? And including justice to the land. So Hashem is saying, I needed a day off after created all of this for you. You are going to take that day off to honor me and spend time with each other and eat good food and take shots of scotch. That's what we do at eCar anyway. And learn, and pass them on to your children and to each other and be in conversation with each other. In addition to that, we're going to apply this to the land that provides all this sustenance that you need. The land actually needs a year to rest, which scientifically makes a lot of sense. The work that Stephan and I are in right now, he mentioned the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which accounts for 85% of sector-wide emissions in New York State. We've still got to account for 15%. Guess what? Leaving that land alone and treating it correctly and allowing soil to do what it's meant to do can in fact sequester gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions and equivalents that are in our atmosphere, which is, I think, around 418 parts per million, where it really needs to be closer to 350, hence the organization 350.org, which was founded by the aforementioned Bill McKibben. So to me, like the Shemitah year it makes natural sense, right? Just from a scientific perspective. But being that we're Jews, we also have to sprinkle in some morality, because that's what we do. So in fact, it's like, look, just because I said don't till the land, don't work the land, don't work yourself, give this land time to rest, doesn't mean that things aren't going to grow, right? Because things are going to grow. In fact, the moral aspect of it is the law of gleaning. Whatever grows, you shall not sell it. That is available for anyone and everyone. And I love that idea, because I think that everything that you said earlier, Rabbi, about this crisis that we're in, and how individualism isn't going to work anymore and never did work in the first place, is this idea that separation from the land was the beginning of our separation from each other, right? And going back to what Stephan said, it is not a coincidence that all these things are connected. We have rising emissions, as you noted, that is working contemporaneously with rising anti-Semitism, as we know globally, and we're seeing right here in the United States, of course, which is rising with global rising white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So the Shemitah year has like special significance for me, because I think that there are legal mandates now of taking care of the land, and also teaches us about like the moral aspects. And then I see my dear sister, Michelle Krause, our senior social worker at my organization, New York Lecture for the Public Interest. The social work aspect also keeps us together. We're going to grow things. And what we grow together, we're going to enjoy together. We're not going to sell it. It belongs to everyone, and it all goes back to what Rabbi Shuli played earlier. This land is literally our land, and it also reminds us why billionaires suck. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Anthony. So many good questions are coming in that I want to do 2 lightning rounds, and then I want to open it up to folks who have questions, many of which great ones have come in, and keep them coming into my chat. So this is a lot. As we started at the beginning, it's a lot to take in. I think that the Dayenu's premise is that the reason that most of those 80% of American Jews are not engaging in systemic efforts for change is for 2 reasons. One is how to meaningfully make a difference. We're going to talk about this in a minute, but how to actually make change at the level that's required. And so part of Dayenu's work is creating pathways for meaningful systemic action collectively in community. And the second is that it's so freaking overwhelming to actually take in the idea that there may not be enough food for my children to eat, or air to breathe, or water to drink, that's already a reality for more and more communities. It's like too much for our souls to bear. And so we turn away, we get busy, we distract ourselves, right? That's part of, there's denial, there's delay, and there's distraction, all things that keep us from really making the change we need to make. So one of the pillars of Dayenu's work is also building spiritually rooted climate movement. We've developed workshops to support people and communities to grapple with these existential, emotional, spiritual issues. We're producing new Jewish climate music. We're bringing faith and spirit and climate Torah and song to the movement. But even as this is a central part of Dayenu's work, I know that my staff and our activists and myself, we struggle sometimes to stay energized and hopeful. And COVID and the current kind of political and societal environment has only made that harder. So I would love for us to do just a quick lightning round, 1 minute, 2 maximum. How do you stay engaged and energized day in and day out? What gives you hope? Stephan?
It's a big question. I think what I'd say, is you have to figure out the balance, right? As we've said over and over, an individual action is not necessarily going to make a difference anymore, but also you have to, if you don't want to be overwhelmed, if you don't want to just feel no agency over this, you have to figure out a practice that makes a difference. And so figuring out an organization or a way to work with your congregation or your community to make an impact actually is not just a way to have an actual impact, but it's a way to feel fulfilled and connected and understand that your actions make a difference. And so, part of me wants to say, call the mayor every week, right? Make it part of your practice, but also, make sure you're doing that with other people, right? We have toolkits, get some friends. It's hard to do it in person now, but all of you, have a glass of wine or, have your kids play and take a half an hour and make calls to the governor or the mayor or any number of people, because it actually does make a difference, right? And you don't necessarily see it and feel it if you're on your own, but there's an opportunity there to take this crisis and connect more with each other and build something.
Thanks. Christina?
Yeah, I really want to echo that. I mean, all of our work is really done collaboratively. We work in small groups in our engagements with companies. But one thing I didn't mention about our just transition work and a lot of our other work as well, we work with communities. So we work with labor, we're doing this deep place-based work in Massachusetts right now, supporting climate policy in Massachusetts, as because we have it in New York. It's great. And so investors are weighing in, making the business case for important climate policy. We're connected with community groups. There's a big coalition called Gas Leaks Allies, and they're concerned about gas leaks and the future of gas. And they're trying to move the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and then, other parts of New England off gas. So we work with them on a regular basis. We talk to labor. We have them inform our engagements, and they participate in our engagements with companies. So that collective action, that ability to work with people within our network and beyond every day is frankly what keeps me going. It's very inspiring, and it's important. You get lots of good ideas, and you can, rely on each other and support each other, sustain each other. And I totally agree with Stephan. Connecting, call your policymaker, your legislator, your governor, your representatives in Washington, your state representatives, get connected to local groups who are working on the climate crisis. They'll have plenty of suggestions for what to weigh in on in terms of policy. It's very, very important.
Anthony, what gives you hope?
Yeah, there's an amazing book by a gentleman named Raymond Williams, and it's called To Be Truly Radical is to Make Hope Possible Rather Than Despair Convincing. And what a great title for a book. What makes me hopeful is everything that has been said, and the realization that we have to localize it, which can make it a bit less overwhelming. I remember sometimes just being so overwhelmed with everything and running into Rabbi Browser's office and going, especially when I found out I was going to be a father for the first time. And she'd always say, start with the Shema, Just start there. Like it's like really easy, and build off of that. And so what gives me hope is, I think, especially with the work I do with Stephan, is this realization that we have to localize it. I'm not discouraging people from calling their Congress people. The federal government is a beast, and that's real. However, if we really look at where the most immense change has happened in this country, it started at the local level in Montgomery, Alabama, and in Birmingham, Alabama. Mickey Schwerner and Andy Goodman, two white Jewish people who knew that they were risking their lives going to Philadelphia, Mississippi. What happened to them with James Chaney dying in the same pool of blood created even more hope. So I would say what gives me hope is the realization that civil rights is a spiritual endeavor, and therefore climate justice is a spiritual endeavor. And if we nourish our spirits, that's one thing they can't take from us. And I think that we've learned that as Jewish people, like Holocaust dispossession, removed from land, and all in between. It was just that this idea that like they can never take away our spirit or our really great recipes for matzo ball soup. And things, and matzo ball soup, Rabbi, always gives me hope. Just tell me that doesn't work when you're at your lowest. Go eat Blippi's like matzo ball soup, and that's like the beginning of the Shema. Start there.
Thanks, Anthony. And I would be remiss with all this talk about acting collectively to not encourage folks to join or start Dayenu circles. There are about 90 of them in various stages of creation across the country. The ones on the Upper West Side often work together with JCAN New York, which is a great partner of ours and part of New York Renews, I know as well. But we do trainings and resources, and you become part of a whole network, and you plug into both national campaigns and also support. Dayenu offers support for you to take local action in partnership, going back to New York Renews. That's such an important part. And it's part of how the Jewish community also shows up as allies in the larger climate movement. So just a plug for you to think about it. We don't have to do this alone. And that is undoubtedly a central part of hope. So last lightning round, before we open up to questions, if people were to leave here tonight and do two things to address the climate crisis, what would you recommend those two things be? Christina? You're on mute.
Mute myself. There has to be somebody who doesn't go off mute. I think some of it, I've already talked about. So one of the we have 4 climate campaigns at ICCR. One is on just transition, one is on methane, another one is on engaging the banks and insurance companies to try to get them to change. And the 4th one is on climate lobbying. So trying to get companies to support science-based policy. We can't get where we need to go without the policy. So at the risk of repeating myself, I'd say, press your elected officials, but also, any connections you have to companies. You are consumers, and they really care about, especially the brands, they care a lot about what consumers think. So, within the Dayenu circles, maybe think about how you can get some consumer campaigns going to press companies to support things like the Build Back Better Act, or, they're probably going to pull the climate provisions out now and vote on those separately. And we'll be lucky if they get through, because there are a lot of important things there. But a lot of the social policy in that is really critical to the health of our economy. And we can't address the climate crisis if we leave people behind. That's the whole point of the just transition. So I think, really reminding policymakers that those other elements are critically important. It's not just getting greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. It's like, how do we make this whole transition, this whole transformation happen? So, get involved in campaigns. I know Dayenu is about to launch a campaign actually targeting the finance sector, which will be fantastic because there's a lot of activity in that space. And I'll put a few things in the chat, some links, so folks can look just to learn a little bit more about our space because, it's interesting.
Stephan.
I mean,
quickly, two things that people should do.
There is so much going on in the world, and I'll just agree with everything that's been said, right? Find a local group, a Dayenu circle, you can look up our other members, like get connected to folks and make it a regular practice, right? Don't leave here and do two things once and then move on, right? Find out a way to make it a sustainable and wholesome practice for yourself. And two, just to highlight two issues, right? We're really trying to build towards making sure that the state does the implementation of the work right. And so even if you're not an expert, like learning a little bit about what it means, right? If you were a teacher, this is going to have implications for schools and school buses and your school in particular, right? If you worked at the Y, it doesn't matter, right? This is going to have an implication there. And so find out how your institutions, your community is engaging it there. And then I would not want to leave without mentioning, like, New York City also in 2019 passed a really important piece of climate legislation, and the new administration in the city is really looking to weaken it. And so it doesn't have a cool name, it's Local Law 97, but it would require very large buildings in the city to become more energy efficient, which again does not sound glamorous, but buildings in New York City produce the vast majority of the emissions, right? You all live in the greenest place basically in the country, because we all live crammed together in big buildings. And if those big buildings could become more energy efficient, we'd actually have a huge step towards climate change. And if it stays strong, that actually is moving other cities in that direction. And in this moment, lots of people are saying we don't want to do that work, right? It takes a little bit of work now to save a lot of money and lives later on. And I could drop more about that in the chat.
Thanks. Anthony, two things.
Yes, no, I'll push back on 7. Local Law 97 is a very cool name. It's the Climate Mobilization Act. It doesn't get much cooler than that. But two things. One, read the prayer in your mezuzah. Like, just remember what that is actually telling us. There's all these amazing mitzvot just right in the mezuzah. It includes, like, we are one, teaching this to our children, teaching this to each other. And then I would say find 5 local targets, to Stephan's point, local targets who can affect change in your given community with Dayenu circles. And maybe, I just made this up, have action onegs, like once an Erev Shabbat a month. We all know what goes on at onegs, like what it's fun to hang out with people and eat while drinking a lot and making calls to local elected officials who you have access to. And I've never told Stephan this, but like, I'm a little tipsy sometimes when I have to talk about serious stuff to like local officials. It just takes the edge off a bit. And I love onegs, and it's a combination of community and community action. And I'll talk to you about that. Maybe Rabbi, we'll talk about what that looks like. But an action oneg once a month, just especially as this damn pandemic is starting to fleet, Baruch Hashem, it's starting to fleet. We can come together again in our homes. A minion of 10 or more people eating, drinking together, and calling your local officials. So read your mezuzah, find 5 targets, start a Dayenu chapter, drink with spirit, and then call your local officials on a Shabbat.
Thanks, Anthony. So I was asked to just weigh in quickly on this question about what one can do. I mentioned about a Dayenu circle. We, Dayenu, have spent the last year really kind of doubling down and all in on Build Back Better in a variety of ways, which we continue to give a final push to try to get across the line. Even with that most major investment, please God, in clean energy, and infrastructure and supporting communities, it will not be enough. And the pipeline of money that is supporting the fossil fuel industry needs to be turned off. We have to keep it in the ground, and we have to shift from investing in destruction to investing in a creative, sustainable future. And so Dayenu on February 17th is launching a new campaign to end the era of fossil fuels. And envision and build a just, sustainable future. And the campaign will focus on removing financial support for the fossil fuel industry by pressuring banks and investment houses to ditch fossil fuel and invest in clean energy. This is something that is not, Dayenu is not making this up. This is a major movement, but the Jewish community has not been deeply engaged and mobilized around this. And secondly, to mobilize the Jewish community to shift our communal resources to clean energy, our investments. So I want to encourage everyone, one thing to do is to go onto our website and sign up for the launch call on February 17th. And if you're not able to make it, sign up to get more information so that you can be part and join thousands of Jews across the country that are joining the growing Jewish climate movement that's working in partnership with other communities across the country. So, some questions. Yale, we haven't talked about some of the political dynamics at play around climate. So the Yale Climate Communication Center finds that among Republicans under the age of 40, over 70% are concerned about climate change. Yet Republicans in political office are very often not supporting climate legislation. This question says, effective legislation is best done in bipartisan support. What outreach is being done to find and recruit Republicans to lobby on behalf of the climate? Anyone want to take a stab at this?
Really quick. Oh, I'm sorry, Christina. Yeah, no, please.
No, go ahead.
I mean, simply, actually, yes, that is true, Rabbi. The best way to target Republicans is to engage with their young people, because it turns out that young Republicans are also concerned about their collective futures and the planet, and don't necessarily agree with their elder counterparts. And if we get to them early, and also can really impress upon them this need for working class solidarity, right? I mean, Stephan and I talk about this all the time. I mean, some of my favorite people are in Appalachia, or in these red places. We have to go back and remind them what it was like back in the 1920s, in the earlier part of the 20th century, when working class Jewish, Black, Brown people stood together, and sometimes like in violent resistance against their oppressors. Blair Mountain, Eastern Western Tennessee, the Maroons of North Carolina. So I would say it's very, don't disengage and don't assume that leadership is the same as rank and file, which is the same, as Stephan also knows, is the same paradigm you should apply even to left-wing labor, is rank and file more so than leadership. So yeah, enter conversation and then have them squeeze their leaders. I think it's really important.
Thanks. Question for Christina. Companies change due to market signals. What would provide a market signal that would help businesses invest in clean energy?
Oh, yeah, well, that's the policy that we need in Washington. I mean, for sure, it's tax incentives. I should say, though, that thanks to the Obama, support through tax incentives for solar and wind, also, which have been extended over time in a bipartisan way, by the way, because they benefit, states across the country. Prices have dropped for wind and solar by like 90%, in the last decade. It's really been an astonishing thing. So it's actually cheaper now to build renewable energy than it is to burn fossil fuels to create power. The problem, the place where we need prices to drop more is for battery storage. And we need really long-term battery storage, because the utilities have several mandates. They have to produce reliable, affordable, energy that is, it has to be reliable. It has to be there. Now, you have storms and people are without power for weeks. I mean, so, it's like climate crisis is a huge threat for utilities, but they still feel like that's why they want gas, because, they need to be able to make sure they can provide power over time. But we need business model change. We need the regulators to change. The whole energy market needs to change, because right now companies make money through big capital intensive infrastructure projects. That's where they make their they have a guaranteed profit from building a gas plant, for instance. And so start like learning about the utility sector is really, really important. You can engage your regulators and just ask questions, join groups that are putting pressure on, and trying to raise questions among the regulators who set the rules for what these utility companies can and can't do. Because most of some utilities are municipally owned. Most of the power in this country is produced by investor-owned utilities. They have to pay, their shareholders. And so there's some conflict there. And I think there's a whole big debate we could have on another section about democratizing energy. And it's really, it's a very, very important and interesting issue. But anyway, maybe I'll stop there.
Yes.
I think the incentives are there. They need to be continued to answer the question in policy. And and then just, getting involved, you can't separate policy from what's actually happening on the ground. So it's really important.
So question about climate justice and the Jewish community. So people often talk about climate justice, the intersection with climate and race and poverty. And as we've talked about, the role of frontline communities. So as we work to address the climate crisis, how do we as Jews, a community that, while certainly diverse, is still majority white and relatively affluent, how do we work in a way that addresses climate injustice and honors the role of frontline communities?
I think Stephan could take this as well. I think that's exactly what we do at New York Renews. I think that the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is a manifestation of that question. And I would push back a bit that maybe it's projected as a majority white and affluent movement or community. That said, if you're looking at what's been the most impactful, it's been coming from the people who are most impacted. And the results are like the Climate Mobilization Act, which Stephan raised earlier, and the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which absolutely prevents, we for instance have seen the fruits of this labor. Late last year, the Department of Environmental Conservation denied 2 fossil fuel peaker plant permits in Astoria, Queens and Newburgh, New York, citing the CLCPA, and also specifically citing disproportionate impacts to environmental justice communities. So that's the result of what it looks like. It's what we do at Stephan, you should also opine on this. It's what Michelle Krause and I do at New York Lawyers for Public Interest, this community lawyering approach of we're not coming in with a top-down approach. As a matter of fact, the people who are being most impacted are going to tell us what to do, and we're going to listen. We call it community lawyering. And then Stephan, I'll kick it to you to just even talk about our values at New York Renews.
Yeah, I mean, I can drop some more in the chat. I mean, I think it really is about listening, right? It's about listening and actually taking it seriously and not going in. And I'd say it's a very similar answer to the question about how to deal with Republicans, right? People at heart have things that they care about. And if you can engage them authentically and listen and actually create a framework where you can respond, right? Often, right, and where it gets into tokenizing and really problematic behavior is it's all well and good to ask, but if that doesn't have an impact on your behavior the next day, right, then why do you bother doing it? And so, we've built a coalition around the principle that we have members in member organizations in leadership who represent the full spectrum of the coalition, and we talk and ask. It is my full-time job, folks across the state, what matters to them and how we do this and in a way that aligns with their values. So there's tremendous work that's developed in the environmental justice and climate justice movement to guide that thinking. And where folks who have been treated really badly by the dominant power structure have really put thought into what those principles look like, and those principles of environmental justice, and lots of other work that really guides how we can authentically engage. And it's a hard struggle, right, to do it in a way that is respectful and authentic. But if we're not trying, we guarantee the outcome is going to be bad.
Yeah, I just want to add one small thing to that we also, really try to do that. I mean, we're, a different space altogether, but we, in this, I mean, we use the Hermes principles in our roundtable that we had with utilities and,
Christina,
investors, EJ.
Say what the Hermes principles are.
Oh, I don't know if I could give a good summary of them, but they're good principles for, respectful listening and meeting. So I'm sure Stephan or Anthony have a clear, I mean,
and they're in the chat right
In
now.
the chat.
oh, yay, thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, there are quite a few. But in our work, we just developed a statement, an investor statement. It's not public yet because we're still accepting signatories this week, but we're up over $1 trillion. And it's a very progressive statement on community impacts and labor, sort of how communities and labor should be the concerns that need to be taken into account in the transition. And this is an investor statement, investors saying, this is what we care about, and we're going to take it to companies, and our community partners can take it to policymakers, and we could take it to policymakers too, and just say, this is, a section of the economy, we're investors and, we're investing in companies and projects and that we care about this, and this is really important. And it was informed by deep conversations with a whole host of both labor and environmental justice groups. So I think that respect of just listening is really, really important.
Thank you. So good to hear from all three of you. I can see why B'nai Jeshurun called you all together to speak. And I've really appreciated the varying altitudes that we've covered this evening. I think it's pretty clear that the most important thing to do is to make a commitment tonight to move from angst to action, to take that feeling, whether it's something that wakes you up in the dead of night and keeps you up, or it's just a vague feeling of unease about the future, and to commit to acting on that feeling, as Stephan said, to make it a practice. And to take one of these many actions and to join thousands of Jews across the country who are part of a growing Jewish climate movement, which is part of a growing national climate movement, which is part of a growing global climate movement, working for a world that's going to be just and livable and sustainable for all of us and our children and our grandchildren for generations to come, because it's going to take all of us. And I'll just close by saying just a word about the name Dayenu, because I think it reflects some of what we've talked about tonight, both the urgency and the hope. As most of you know, Dayenu is the joyous song that we sing each year at the Passover Seder when we tell the story of the Jewish people's journey from slavery to freedom. And it recounts all the things that God's done for us. God had taken us out of Egypt, but not given us the Torah. Dayenu goes on. And we usually say it would have been enough. But Dayenu also means we've had enough destruction, enough valuing fossil fuel companies over human life, enough letting the impacts of the climate crisis fall disproportionately on Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor communities. Dayenu. But here's where the double entendre comes in, because it also means we have enough. We have what we need to confront the climate crisis and move towards climate solutions. We have the resources and the policies and the technology. We have what we need so that everyone can have enough. So now is really the time for us to join together in this sacred and urgent work, because nothing less than the future of our collective humanity is at stake. So I really want to thank you, Anthony and Stephan and Christina, for this conversation. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Shuli.
Thank you, Jennie. Thank you, everyone, Christina and Anthony and Stephan, for a very rich and important conversation. A lot of takeaways, including Anthony, as soon as we can come back in person, we're starting the Action Onegs. You're invited. Please come. Everybody, please come. We have a lot of ways that we can be involved. As Jennie, your statistic at the beginning that 80% of American Jews think that addressing the climate crisis is important, but do not engage. That is very, very striking, really troubling. And I think at BJ, we have had a wonderful group, BJ Environmental Advocates. I see Les Judd, who's one of the co-chairs here, has been leading that group for a while, that has worked in a number of different ways to help make some change at BJ and to inspire people to make change in their own lives, including our new environmental pledge that we just sent information out about. And we want people to take the pledge and make their own commitments, as you said, and we want people to bring some new energy into our environmental activism at BJ and come together and think about ways that we can be doing more at the policy level, at the organizing level, which is something that we haven't done for a while. So I really want to invite people to think at this very local level, in your own home, in your own practice, in your own space. What's the commitment you can take on, and let us know what that's going to be. And then come to some of our community conversations that are going to be about the environmental pledge and thinking about how we bring that more broadly and more deeply into the BJ community. So the first conversation on that is going to be February 22nd. So the information is on our website. And as I said, we'll be sending out an email later this week with all of this information, the resources that were in the chat, ways that you can follow up. So I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. And again, a huge thank you to Stephan and Anthony, Jennie, and Christina for sharing your wisdom and your hope with us, because we need that too. We need that too. So let's take the agitation, the radical agitation of the Shemitah year to inspire us to make these commitments, big and small, but most of all together. Look forward to doing that work with all of you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks very much.